6 years. That's how long it had been since I last heard my mother's voice in anything but the echo of a memory I stopped replaying. No birthday calls. No messages after a convoy bombing in Fallujah took part of my hearing. No apology after an anonymous letter nearly stalled my promotion. Just silence. Deliberate. Decorated. And now out of nowhere, a wedding invitation. Thick cardstock gold print formal to the point of frostbite. And one handwritten word inside. Behave. Not we miss you. Not hope to see you, just that. As if I were some loose thread they had to pin down for appearance's sake. But I said yes. Not for reconciliation, not for closure. I said yes so they'd be forced to remember the one woman they worked so hard to forget is still standing. I leaned back in my chair staring across my office. The late afternoon light threw long shadows across the framed photos on the wall. My unit in Mosul. The ribbon ceremony in D.C. The smiling faces of soldiers whose names I still remembered even after a decade. It had been over 6 years since I last heard either of their voices in person. No calls on my birthday, no texts on deployment returns. No messages when I lost partial hearing in a roadside bombing near Fallujah. Just silence. Carefully curated weaponized silence. And now suddenly I was invited to Lydia's wedding. My younger sister, the golden child. The one who always looked perfect in photos and never once showed up to a base. I turned the invitation over in my hands again. Maybe they didn't find me at all. Maybe the Army's event protocol team had forwarded it automatically. Or maybe Lydia Ever, the image manager, decided that having the estranged older sister in a starched uniform tucked somewhere in the back row would give her wedding the kind of narrative she could sell to guests with matching dresses and perfect teeth. It wasn't an olive branch. It was theater. And I wasn't invited to be family. I was invited to be proof that they tried. That's the thing about revenge stories. People assume they start with rage. But mine didn't. It started with disbelief. Then quiet curiosity. Did they even remember how to spell my name outside? The Colorado wind tapped at the glass pane of my office window, cold and rhythmic. Like it had something to say, but no words to offer. I stood and looked down across the Fort Clark training grounds. A new wave of recruits were out on the field shouting drills and stumbling through formation. Young, eager, loud. They hadn't yet learned what it felt like to be erased by the very people who taught you how to tie your boots. I envied that kind of ignorance. A knock came short and steady. I didn't look away from the window. "Come in," I said. The door creaked open and Major Collins stepped in, always half a step too observant. "You going?" he asked, casually nodding toward the envelope still on my desk. "Just got it," I replied, voice flat. He raised an eyebrow. "That what we're calling it?" I didn't answer, and he didn't push. Collins wasn't just an aide, he was a veteran in all the quiet ways that counted. Knew when to press and when to leave space. I turned back toward my desk and picked up the invitation one last time. "Lydia Reese and Jacob Hartley request the honor of your presence." I stopped reading halfway down the card. Hartley. I'd heard the name before. Captain Jacob Hartley, 3rd Battalion Logistics Officer. We'd crossed paths briefly during a joint exercise in Okinawa. Nothing more than a passing handshake, a rank exchange, a briefing room nod. I didn't even remember his face. But I remembered his name. Of course she picked a soldier. She always wanted what she thought made me special without ever wanting the burdens that came with it. I set the card down and opened the top drawer of my file cabinet. Inside, wrapped in a linen cloth, was the formal uniform I hadn't worn in over a year. Still pressed. Still perfect. I stared at the 4 silver stars gleaming from the shoulder boards. I hadn't earned them for appearances, and I wasn't going to wear them now to show off. I would wear them as a reminder that I existed. That I mattered. That they didn't get to write me out of the story just because I didn't fit into the script. I folded the invitation, slid it into the breast pocket of my coat and walked out. Not because I needed to be there, but because they needed to remember I still was. The drive into Wilmont was like flipping through a scrapbook I didn't ask to see. Route 37 still curved along the ridge, the same dogwood trees lining both sides of the road like old sentries. The town hadn't changed much. The gas station still had the faded sign that used to blink at half power, and the bakery on Elm still advertised homemade pie even though everyone knew they got their crusts from a supplier in Scranton. Everything was preserved, curated, neat. Too neat. The kind of place where the cracks didn't show until you got up close. I pulled into the cul-de-sac just before sunset. The house stood at the end, pale blue siding, flower boxes still under the front windows. My mother's hydrangeas were trimmed back with military precision. Not a leaf out of place. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment watching the porch lights flicker on automatically. The front door opened before I even reached the steps. Martha Reese didn't wait for knocks. She looked exactly the same. Same bobbed silver hair, same pressed cardigan, same expression like she was grading a term paper she already expected to be disappointed by. "Madeline," she said, voice flat but clipped. Then she looked at my uniform and paused just long enough to make sure I noticed. "Don't ruin this for your sister." Not hello. Not welcome home. Just a directive, as if I were an employee arriving late to a corporate function. I gave her a nod, tight and meaningless, and stepped past her into the hallway. The scent hit me first. Lemon polish and something faintly chemical. Martha's signature, cleanliness used like armor. The walls were still hung with the same framed pictures from 2 decades ago. Lydia in her cheer uniform. Dad holding up a trout from Lake Worth. Me in 8th grade smiling with braces before the army shaped my spine straighter than our family ever could. Nothing had changed. And somehow that made it worse. She followed behind me without saying much. The dining room was already full, voices, low and overlapping. 14 people around the table, I counted without meaning to. Aunts, uncles, cousins, Lydia's college roommate and her husband. Everyone looked up when I entered. A few polite nods. No one stood. No one said my name. The table had been extended with the leaf insert white linen spread tight across it, candles flickering in symmetrical holders. Every seat had a little name card. Not mine. Instead, there was a single folding chair placed near the sideboard just shy of the warmth from the kitchen door. No cushion. No linen. A napkin tucked under the edge of the plate like an afterthought. I took the seat anyway. Quietly. Lydia glanced over from halfway down the table. She looked radiant in the way women do when they're playing a part they wrote themselves. Hair in perfect waves, teeth a shade too bright. Her fiancé Jacob Hartley sat beside her. I recognized him now. Taller than I remembered. He didn't look my way. Dinner began with Martha's usual grace. A short blessing that mentioned unity and family legacy. I noticed the word love was conspicuously absent. Plates passed clockwise. Sliced ham, scalloped potatoes, green beans with slivered almonds. Conversation picked up again. Lydia talked about the florist canceling last minute. Uncle Russ complained about his back. Someone made a joke about the best man forgetting the rings. Not one word was directed toward me. At one point my cousin Jenny caught my eye and gave me a small half smile. It lasted less than a second before she turned back to her husband and murmured something. He glanced at me once, then didn't look again. It was like watching myself attend my own funeral. Present but removed. A polite ghost. The chair I sat on creaked every time I shifted. I caught Martha glance at it with a flicker of annoyance, like I was disrupting the ambiance. Eventually, Jacob cleared his throat and asked about the rehearsal schedule for tomorrow. Martha pulled out a neatly folded agenda and began assigning times. Lydia added her own notes about hair appointments and arrival windows. The entire conversation moved like clockwork, excluding me with stunning efficiency. When dessert was served, Lydia stood and clinked her spoon lightly against her glass. "Just a quick thank you to everyone who made the effort to be here," she said sweetly. "And to those who traveled across time zones, we're grateful." She looked directly past me as she said it. I was sitting 8 feet away and she looked at the wall behind my head. "You all mean so much to us. Especially those who have always supported our journey even when things got complicated." That earned a few murmurs of appreciation, nods, and the faintest chuckle from someone near the other end of the table. I set down my fork. The lemon tart on my plate was untouched. After coffee, people began drifting toward the living room. Some stood in the hallway to chat. No one asked me to join a conversation. No one asked how long I'd be staying. I slipped out the side door past the garbage bins into the night air that finally felt honest. Cold and unpretending. The stars above Wilmont hadn't changed. But the place beneath them that hadn't been mine in a long time. The first time I read the report, I thought it was a prank. I was stationed in Stuttgart, then overseeing a joint logistics operation. My days were long stacked with supply chain audits, personnel evaluations, and classified briefings. The envelope had arrived without warning, sealed in standard army brown. I opened it expecting another budget memo. Instead, I found a printed copy of a complaint filed anonymously to the Department of Defense Ethics Council. The allegations were specific. That I had exaggerated my actions in a field report from Syria. That my Bronze Star was obtained through favoritism. That I had a history of manipulating internal reporting to appear more effective than I was. And finally, the kicker. That my pending promotion to Brigadier General was a result of political pressure rather than merit. I sat at my desk and read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because my brain refused to register them as real. The language was clinical, pointed, filled with insider jargon. Whoever wrote it had access. Not just to systems, but to my rhythms. They knew how I documented things. What I emphasized, where I was most vulnerable. The next day, my promotion was frozen pending internal review. They called it routine. Said it was standard procedure. That it didn't mean anything. But I knew better. I had spent 21 years in uniform, the last 10 in command roles. I'd led in Fallujah, coordinated airlift evacuations in Mosul, and rebuilt logistical lines in Kandahar after half our trucks had been wiped out. I didn't fake numbers. I didn't chase medals. I didn't need to. I had been vetted more times than I could count. Cleared for top-level briefings, trusted to train incoming colonels. And now, with one letter, I was being treated like a liability. At first, I did nothing. Not out of guilt, but out of disbelief. Then came Major Collins. He dropped the manila folder on my desk 2 weeks later without a word. I opened it slowly. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a summary of the Ethics Board's preliminary findings. The second, a linguistic analysis. I didn't even know we had people who did that. But apparently in cases involving anonymous whistleblowing, the Pentagon sometimes used linguistic pattern analysis to assess the source. Sentence structures, common phrases, word choice, even punctuation habits. The results were printed in black and white. 94% match to Lydia Reese. Secondary contributor Martha Reese. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. I just closed the folder, pushed it aside, and stared out the window at a group of cadets drilling in the snow. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, because I wasn't. I was hollowed out. I thought about how many times I had carried Lydia's boxes up 3 flights of stairs when she moved to NYU. The time I skipped a rare weekend off to fly back for her college graduation. How I used my contacts to get her an informational interview with a PR firm in Chicago when she was floundering after school. I thought about my mother's tight smile when I told her about my first deployment. How she said, "Try not to get in the papers unless it's good news." They didn't want me to fail, they wanted me small. Easier to control, easier to dismiss. I never confronted them. Not even when my name was cleared. Not even when the board sent an official apology and my promotion was reinstated the following year. Because by then the damage had already been done. Not to my record, to my faith. There's a difference between being ignored and being sabotaged. One feels like neglect, the other feels like betrayal that's been ironed and folded and left on your pillow like a goodbye. Linda Snow called me 3 months later. A former Army JAG turned federal advisor, she had handled my internal appeal. She asked if I wanted to pursue disciplinary action. File a formal complaint. Press criminal charges if we could prove access to restricted documents. I said no. She didn't understand at first. Neither did Collins, but I did. Dragging it out wouldn't fix anything, and I wasn't interested in vengeance built on court filings. What I wanted was quieter. Longer. I wanted to live in a way they couldn't edit, So I put on my uniform, accepted my star when it came, and went back to work. But I never looked at Lydia's name the same way again. Not when she emailed me months later with a link to her new PR campaign. Not when she posted a photo of our childhood backyard and tagged it Family Roots. Not when she wrote a tribute to Dad on Facebook and didn't mention that I flew back alone to bury him while she was at a yoga retreat in Sedona. I saved the analysis report in a locked file on my laptop. Not because I needed proof, but because sometimes even now I still wake up wondering if I imagined it all. I didn't. The words were hers. The tone was Martha's, and the silence that followed was mine to carry. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd moved on. But sitting at that folding chair in Wilmont, breathing in lemon polish and biting into silence, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit. Some wounds don't close, they calcify. They settle deep in the spine and change your posture forever. And no matter how straight you stand, someone will always remember the day they bent you. I was 13 the first time I realized Lydia had a permanent pass. It was a Saturday morning and we were both supposed to help clean out the garage. Dad had already pulled the bikes and camping gear onto the driveway. I was in sweatpants, hands full of cobwebbed boxes, while Lydia stood inside the doorway perfectly dressed, holding a phone and saying she had to call Mia about the school dance. I remember Dad sighing, rubbing his forehead, then telling me to just let her go. She's younger, Maddie. Let it go. It became a pattern after that. Lydia didn't mow the lawn because she had sensitive skin. Lydia didn't do dishes because the detergent made her hands peel. Lydia didn't shovel snow because she had a group project due. Every time I filled in, Mom called me responsible. Every time Lydia skipped out, Mom called her delicate. By the time we hit high school, the distance had turned into altitude. Lydia became untouchable. She got braces before I did, a cell phone before I did. When she failed algebra sophomore year, Mom met with the counselor to blame the teacher. When I aced pre-calc and made captain of the volleyball team, Mom said nothing. She just reminded me not to gloat. When I got my acceptance letter to the West Grove Military Academy, I printed it out and taped it to the fridge. Mom walked in, read it quietly, then said without turning, "Military for girls is brave, I suppose. No congratulations, no dinner out, no party." The next year, when Lydia was accepted to NYU's School of Communications, we threw a backyard celebration. Balloons. Cake. Neighbors invited. Dad grilled ribs. Mom ordered custom cupcakes that spelled out Lydia NYC. I flew in from Virginia for one weekend. Stayed 3 nights in my old room, which had been converted into a sewing studio. On the second night, I tried to tell them about my field leadership course. How I'd gotten the top physical score in the class. Lydia checked her phone. Mom refilled her wine. "You always make everything so intense, Maddie," Lydia said finally. "It's not a war zone." That was before I'd even seen one. In 2007, I returned home for my first real leave after deployment. 7 months in Kandahar. 2 friends buried. Heat that didn't leave your bones for weeks. I came back with a tan so deep my own reflection startled me. When I walked through the door of the house in Wilmont, I expected, I don't know, something. A sign. A question. At the very least, an acknowledgement that I had survived a place most Americans couldn't even pronounce, but the television was on. Mom was folding laundry. Lydia was on the back deck with her boyfriend laughing. "Oh, you're early," Mom said when she looked up. Dinner was frozen lasagna. No one asked me about Afghanistan. Lydia showed me photos from her spring break in Miami. I slept in the guest room. The next morning, I came downstairs in a t-shirt that still smelled faintly of sand and diesel and heard Mom on the phone. "She's too intense now. I think the army made her hard." That night, I didn't sleep. I walked to the old elementary school just a few blocks away. I sat on the swing set for over an hour watching the stars bleed across the sky, wondering if maybe I had changed too much to come home. But then I realized something colder. I hadn't changed. I had always been this way. They just didn't like the mirror I held up. I never told them about the time I stayed awake for 72 hours straight, coordinating medevac runs. Or the soldier I pulled from under a flipped Humvee. Or the letter I wrote to a mother in Illinois after her son's heart gave out in the desert. They didn't want those stories. They wanted me quiet, presentable, easy to photograph at Thanksgiving. So I learned to fold my stories like linens. Kept them tucked in my chest clean and unused. Even after Dad passed, and I came back alone for the funeral, I saw the same pattern. Lydia gave the eulogy. Mom wept in the front row. I stood in uniform off to the side. There wasn't even a seat saved for me. She's always been difficult, Mom whispered to someone behind me as if grief had a hierarchy. That was the moment I stopped trying. Not because I didn't care, but because trying only ever made me smaller in their eyes, and I had spent too long learning how to stand tall. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Hayworth Club, one of those suburban event spaces that tried to look like old money but felt more like a catalog. White columns, muted chandeliers, staff in pressed black uniforms. It all smelled like lemon wax and expectation. I arrived alone in my dress blues. Not to make a statement, just because it was the only formal wear I owned that still fit me right. Inside, a hostess with an earpiece asked my name, scanned the list, then motioned toward a brass easel by the door. Seating chart. I stepped up, eyes scanning the calligraphy. Table 1, Lydia and Bennett. Table 2, Martha Reese and extended family. Tables 3 through 6, cousins-in-laws, out-of-town guests. I searched for my full name, my rank, anything resembling acknowledgement. But there was no Madeline Reese. Not even a Major General Reese. Just a scribbled M. Reese tucked into table 12, far corner near the catering door. Close enough to feel the draft from the kitchen every time the staff passed through with trays. The name wasn't even centered, looked like it was added last minute. My seat was next to an older couple I didn't recognize and a kid still in braces who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The napkin at my place setting was a different shade than the others. Slight but deliberate. Not ivory. More cream. Off-tone. Just enough to register without saying anything out loud. I had seen that kind of signaling before. Not in my career, but in the way power masks itself in polite society. I stood beside the table, not sitting yet, surveying the room. Lydia moved through guests like it was her campaign trail. Hug here, kiss on the cheek there, wave, compliment, laugh. She wore a navy dress that hugged her frame and hair done up in soft curls. Perfect. Always perfect. When she spotted me, her expression flickered for half a beat, then settled into practiced charm. She glided over, drink in hand, smile polished. You made it, she said lightly. I told the planner not to make the decor too military, so you wouldn't feel out of place. I didn't respond. She leaned in just a bit. We're so glad you could come. Really? Then she was gone. Back into the crowd. Back to being adored. I took my seat. The food arrived. Chicken in cream sauce. Overcooked asparagus. Soft jazz played over the speakers. Someone at the next table clinked a glass for a toast, but I wasn't listening. Then a shift in the room. A change in posture I recognized before I even saw who caused it. A tall man in a dark tailored suit had entered through the side door. Silver hair, presence that turned heads even without sound. He moved slowly, not because of age, but with intention. Like someone who used to command attention and still knew how. Richard Hartley. Bennett's father. Former CEO of Hartley Logistics. Rumored to have consulted for the Department of Defense in the early 2000s. Old money. Older discipline. He shook hands. Nodded. Greeted people with brief, clipped conversation. Not unkind, just efficient. Then his eyes found me. It was less a double take and more a pause. Recognition without certainty. I didn't move. I let him look. Let him make the connection on his own, if one existed. His brow tightened for a second. He started to step forward, then seemed to think better of it. Someone approached him from the side with a drink. He nodded, smiled faintly, and turned away. But for those few seconds, the noise in the room faded. Not because anyone else noticed, but because I saw something in his eyes. A memory, maybe. Or a shadow of one, and I had seen that look before. From men who'd survived something they never named. I finished my water. Ate 3 bites of chicken. Tried not to count how many people glanced at my uniform and quickly looked away. The speeches started soon after. Lydia's friend gave a funny story about their college days. Bennett's brother toasted to partnership and patience. The microphone passed hands, but not once in my direction. No nod to my presence. No welcome to the sister from out of town. No acknowledgement of the woman who'd flown from DC with 7 stars on her shoulders. When dessert came, I declined. A waiter passed by and offered me coffee. I accepted. The mug was chipped at the rim. Fitting. Across the room, Richard Hartley was speaking with Lydia. She was laughing at something he said, a perfect daughter-in-law smile on display, but his eyes drifted back to me once. Only once. And I saw it again. Not recognition, but remembrance. As if I had once stood in front of him before. As if somewhere in some place neither of us had been ready to name we had already met. I didn't react. Just folded my napkin neatly and set it aside. There would be another moment. I felt it in my gut. And after years of war and silence and sharp-edged grace, I had learned to trust that feeling. The Claremont Country Club looked like it had been carved out of a bridal magazine. White hydrangeas spilled from tall vases. A string quartet played something soft and expensive. Every surface sparkled. Gold-rimmed plates, linen napkins folded like origami, even the ice in the glasses caught light like crystal. I walked in alone. The ushers didn't ask for my name. No clipboard. No seating assistants. Just a nod toward the main ballroom like I already knew where to disappear to. The room was packed. Lydia had pulled off the kind of wedding people wrote checks for out of guilt and legacy. Country club types, board members, neighbors from gated streets, old professors in tweed and young women in gowns that probably came with personal stylists. I scanned the tables. And there it was again, table 12. Tucked between the emergency exit and a stack of extra chairs. Same name card. M. Reese. No rank. No title, no hint of family. The chair wasn't even straight. I pulled it back myself and sat spine-tall, hands in my lap. Nobody glanced my way. And why would they? I wasn't announced. Wasn't listed in the program. Not on the bridal side. Not even marked as family. The woman across from me smiled politely. Her name tag read Krista Feldman. She looked like the kind of person who donated to libraries in exchange for her name on a plaque. "I'm sorry, are you with catering?" she asked gently. "Number." "I'm family." Her eyebrows rose for a second. "Oh. Sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's fine." She turned back to her champagne. Conversation died around me. It didn't matter. I wasn't here for them. A man from the next table leaned toward mine. Late 50s. Burberry tie, glass of bourbon in hand. "So, what's your connection to the bride?" he asked. "I'm her sister." He blinked. "Really?" I thought. "I mean, you're not in any of the family photos on the slideshow." I didn't respond. Just offered a thin smile. He gave a half chuckle and turned away. A server passed with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Bacon-wrapped dates and tiny crab cakes. She paused at my table, hesitant. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you part of the security team?" I looked up at her slowly. Her voice cracked at the last word. "I'm a guest." "Oh, of course. Sorry, just making sure." She walked away quickly, cheeks flushed. I didn't blame her. My dress uniform made people uncomfortable when they didn't know how to place it. The lights dimmed a bit. The DJ welcomed everyone. MCs began calling tables for photos, toasts, greetings. Table 1 was announced. Lydia and Bennett stood hand in hand, glowing. Table 2. Martha. Uncles. Aunts. Familiar last names. Recognized faces. No mention of me. No one turned to wave me forward. No one said my name aloud. I sipped my water and let the silence sit. The photographer moved through tables, snapping candids. He skipped mine, passed by without pause. I watched him take pictures of Lydia hugging her freshman-year roommate, Bennett's law school mentor, even the ring bearer who had cried through most of the ceremony. He never once pointed his lens at table 12. It was surgical. The way I had been cut out, No anger rose in me. Just a kind of cool steadiness. Familiar. The same stillness I'd felt in forward operating bases before sunrise when you didn't know what the day would bring but knew you'd face it anyway. The dance floor opened. Music swelled. Couples moved into rhythm. I remained seated. Someone brushed past me heading toward the bar. I heard them mutter quietly. "Is she someone's date?" A woman replied, "I think she's military." Maybe a bodyguard. I didn't correct them. Didn't rise, didn't explain, let them wonder. Lydia glided across the room like the event was oxygen and she was the only one allowed to breathe it. Her dress shimmered with every step. She posed with flower girls, hugged old neighbors, accepted compliments with modesty so well practiced it bordered on performance art. At one point, she looked across the room. Eyes landed on me for a second. Her smile didn't falter. But she didn't wave. Didn't gesture. Just moved on. I had become the background. An accessory no one requested. The quartet shifted to jazz. Waitstaff reset desserts. Someone spilled wine and laughed. A group of bridesmaids gathered for a group photo and shouted for Lydia to join. The ballroom pulsed with celebration. And still no one asked my name. Not once. Not the MC, not the planner. Not the family whose blood ran in my veins. They had designed this day down to the teaspoon, and in all that orchestration they had made space for everyone. Except me. I looked down at my plate. Fork untouched. Napkin folded, a stranger among familiar faces. A ghost with medals. The lights dimmed just enough to signal attention. A bell chimed softly through the speakers and the room quieted in a ripple of expectation. The MC stepped up with a microphone beaming as he gestured toward the head table. Time for the family to say a few words. Martha stood first. She wore deep emerald, her hair styled in a coif that hadn't moved all night. Her voice, when it came through the sound system, was sweet and syruped. "To my beautiful daughter Lydia and her charming new husband Bennett, may your life be full of grace, prosperity, and most of all loyalty." She smiled. Because nothing makes a mother prouder than children who are elegant and loyal. People clapped politely. Some nodded, a few toasted. I didn't move. Then Lydia rose beside her. She was radiant under the chandelier bouquet of crystals pinned to her waist. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. "And who would have thought my sister could make it?" she began, lips curled just slightly. "All the way from wherever she's stationed these days. Guarding gates, I assume." There were chuckles. Not loud. Just enough to burn. She turned her face toward the crowd, voice still soft. "You know, I almost told the planner to reserve her a seat outside with the valets. But she surprised us. Looked sharp too. I guess those uniforms do hide age well." Another smattering of laughter. I stared at her, my chest still not rising with breath. Martha reached over, touching Lydia's wrist as if to say that's enough. But then she stepped forward again. "Our Madeline," she said, her voice dropping just enough to carry further. "She's always been independent. Difficult, yes, but punctual. At least today." A burst of laughter rolled across the room like cheap fog. Someone at a table near mine coughed on their drink. Glass clinked on china. A guest behind me whispered, "Is she serious?" I pushed my chair back slowly. Stood. Lifted my champagne flute. Not high, just steady. Eyes forward. Directed at the head table. I didn't say a word. Didn't smile, didn't blink. For a few seconds the room faltered. Some turned toward me. Some stopped chewing. Others just glanced awkwardly at their plates, unsure what they were witnessing. But the laughter didn't stop. No one at the head table rose to correct the tone. No one called for respect. No one said enough. I stayed standing for 3 full seconds more. Then I sat back down. My glass didn't touch my lips. My name had been used as punchline. And the crowd had laughed right on cue. The music returned. Another toast followed, this one from a childhood friend of Bennett's. People clapped again. The moment dissolved like sugar in wine. But in that silence, just before I sat, I had caught a single look. Richard Hartley. He had watched it all unfold from his place at the far end of the head table. Arms folded, face still. but his eyes had narrowed just enough to betray thought. Calculation even. Not pity. Recognition. I turned my gaze away before he could speak. The rest of the reception blurred. Speeches. Songs. A slideshow of Lydia's life that skipped every frame I might have been in. Every photo of her birthdays I had taken. The one of her in cap and gown I had flown 6 hours to attend. The beach trip photo I had paid for that house rental when Dad's savings ran low. But I wasn't in them. I was always behind the lens. Just like now. 15 minutes later, a waitress brought out a tray of mini desserts. Macarons. Chocolate cups, raspberry tarts. She offered me the tray with a glance. Sorry, she said, almost whispering. They told me to save extras for family first. I looked her in the eye. I am family. Her lips parted, then closed again. She nodded and left one tart on my plate before scurrying away. Around me the hum of celebration swelled again. Lydia danced with Bennett, laughter trailing behind them like glitter. Martha held court with a group of older guests near the dessert table. Their hands fluttered, delicate and full of stories they'd already rewritten. I looked around one more time. Not for comfort, but for confirmation. I had never truly been invited. I had been summoned. As a mirror. And no one in that room wanted to see what I reflected. It started with a hush. Not the kind that asks for silence politely, but the kind that drapes over a room like a shroud demanding attention. My glass was still in my hand, condensation slipping down my fingers, but I barely felt it. All I felt was every pair of eyes calculating how to pivot. How to laugh it off. How to pretend the moment hadn't fractured. Then I heard the shift. A chair scraped. Slow, deliberate. I turned and Richard Hartley was standing. His expression wasn't shocked, it was resolved. His shoulders squared in a way I recognized immediately. That way only a man trained to face fire could stand when walking into it once more. He didn't glance at Lydia, he didn't check with his wife, he didn't look for permission. He walked. The carpet muffled his steps as he moved past the golden centerpiece of roses and lilies, past the tall champagne flutes and guests frozen mid-toast. He kept walking until he stopped just one pace in front of me, close enough to speak privately. Far enough for the entire room to witness what he was about to do. Then slowly he brought his hand to his chest. And bowed. Not a polite dip of the head. A full military bow of respect. A gesture laced with weight, discipline, and memory. He held it for a beat too long. Long enough for someone to gasp behind us. Long enough for the photographer's flash to go off by instinct, not design. When he stood upright again, his voice was calm, but it rang with the kind of authority that doesn't need a microphone. This is Major General Madeline Reese. She once saved my life. General ma'am, I didn't move. I didn't have to. Behind me someone dropped a fork. A glass tipped over. No one reached for it. Lydia's face lost all its practiced composure. Her fingers trembled around the stem of her flute, and then it slipped through, shattering against the polished wood floor. She didn't bend to pick it up. Her jaw opened like she wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came. Martha's chair screeched as she stood abruptly. Her mouth tightened, searching for control, for damage management. But there was no script for this. No PR pivot polished enough. Jacob stood but didn't move. His face was unreadable. A wall of confusion and dawning comprehension. He looked at his father, then at me. And stayed silent. Richard turned to face the crowd, his voice still calm but now louder, projecting. The woman you tried to laugh off just now, she didn't come here to be seen. She came because this family once forgot who she was. I won't forget. Not again. He looked at me one more time, softer now. Then, without waiting for applause or reaction, he stepped aside. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was loaded. Thick with things unsaid. And then something unexpected happened. From one of the corner tables near the back, a man stood. Retired Colonel Henry Marsh. I remembered him from 2 tours ago, a man whose salute had always been meticulous even in the heat of dust storms and body counts. He raised his hand. A crisp salute. No smile, just respect. A second later, a woman across the room followed. Lieutenant General Sandra Cook retired. Her cane leaned beside her chair. She didn't rise fast, but she rose tall. Her salute was just as steady. Then came a third. A man in civilian clothes whose name I didn't know but whose posture gave him away. Former service. He stood, he saluted. 4 salutes, then 5, then 7. The ballroom didn't know what to do with that. I didn't look at Lydia. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't need to. Because this wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about being the overlooked daughter, the estranged sister, the ghost in uniform. It was about truth. And truth, when finally named, doesn't ask for permission. I looked around the room. At the same people who hours earlier had averted their gaze or asked if I worked security. Now their eyes didn't waver. Some looked embarrassed. Others ashamed, but most simply watched like they were finally seeing something they couldn't unsee. Respect doesn't announce itself. It doesn't beg to be seated at the table. It arrives when you least expect it and sits down without waiting for approval. Richard stood nearby, still quiet, his hands folded. The weight of what he'd just done wasn't lost on me. He hadn't just recognized me. He had named me. Out loud. In front of every person who once refused to say my name. A man I had pulled from a burning convoy outside Kandahar, whose face I hadn't seen under the blood and dust and panic, now stood before me fully intact, fully remembering. That rescue had been buried in years of service and silence. I never expected to meet the man again. He never knew who I was. Until now. Someone finally saw me. Not because I demanded it, but because memory did not fail him. The ceremony paused. Music didn't restart. No one tried to fill the air with laughter or distractions. This wasn't a moment they could edit or spin, it was happening, and they were inside it. For the first time that day, I sat down not because I felt pushed aside, but because I chose to. The weight of years did not pull me under. It steadied me. The staff, once unsure whether to treat me like a guest or a stranger, now moved with sudden deference. Even the MC cleared his throat awkwardly and muttered, "Let's take a brief pause before the next toast." No one objected. I looked at the centerpiece in front of me, white roses in full bloom, and thought how strange it was that in a room full of people who knew my name, it took a stranger to honor it. And I let that silence linger, not to fill it, but to finally breathe inside it. Jacob leaned toward his father, voice low, but urgent. "Is it really her?" Richard didn't glance at him, eyes still fixed on the space where I sat. Washington, D.C., spring of 2016. Near Walter Reed. I collapsed outside the south entrance. Heart failure. She kept me alive until paramedics came. I never got her name. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. A few nearby guests heard it and leaned closer. I didn't flinch. That day came back sharp in my mind. Not as a memory I dwelled on, but as something my hands remembered. The pressure of his chest beneath my palms. The wet chill of sweat through his dress shirt. The way I had dropped to my knees without thinking, uniform pants scuffing against gravel. He had fallen forward mid-step, a half-block from the curb. A stranger screamed. Someone else froze with a coffee cup still balanced in one hand. I had just signed out of the clinic after a briefing on combat trauma recovery. It took one glance to know his heart was going into arrest. I shouted for a defibrillator, but we were too far from the ER wing. I tore open his collar, counted compressions out loud. 23. 24. 25. Breathe. The crowd gathered but didn't help. Phones out. Recording. Useless. When the ambulance finally arrived, I had already cycled through 2 rounds of CPR. I stepped back without fanfare. Didn't wait for gratitude. Just gathered my things and left. It had taken 5 minutes. Now, nearly a decade later, that 5 minutes had followed me into a ballroom laced with chandeliers and hypocrisy. I didn't speak. There was no need. Richard turned slowly toward Jacob now, as if seeing him not as a son but as someone who had let the wrong things shape his view. "You married into a family that forgot the meaning of honor." She didn't forget. Not even when all of you did. Jacob swallowed, his mouth pressed into a thin line. His hands curled into loose fists at his sides. Why didn't she say anything? Because people like her don't need to. Richard's voice wasn't harsh, it was steady. Like he'd just answered his own question after years of not knowing. I looked down at my hands folded in my lap. The same hands that had held rifles and field kits. The same hands that had carried wounded men and letters home to grieving wives. They didn't tremble. A small group of guests stood now, not saluting, not speaking. Just standing. As if the act itself was their own apology. I caught one woman wiping her eye with a linen napkin. At the far end of the hall, the MC adjusted his tie and cleared his throat but thought better of trying to resume the schedule. The wedding timeline had cracked. There was no stitching it back together without first admitting what had broken it. Lydia hadn't moved. She sat at the head table staring straight ahead, her fingers gripping the edge of the white tablecloth so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Martha sat rigid beside her, lips, tight eyes glassy. Her composure cracked but only slightly. Her mind was already spinning, I could tell, crafting a version of this night where she could still come out clean. It wouldn't work. The guests had seen. More importantly, they had listened. Richard returned to his seat without another word. The weight of his revelations still settled in the air like heavy fog. No microphone had delivered it. No slideshow, no music, no photo op, just truth. Unrehearsed, unapologetic, and finally undeniable. One of the servers approached me with a fresh glass of water, hands trembling just slightly. "General Reese," she whispered. Thank you for your service." I met her eyes. "You're welcome." She nodded quickly and stepped away, nearly bumping into a man from the dessert table. He offered me a tight smile and backed off without speaking. Respect isn't about volume. It doesn't need flashing lights or introductions. It just needs clarity. And the courage to say what others are afraid to. The room didn't return to celebration. Not in the same way. The playlist resumed eventually, but the songs didn't ring the same. The toasts that followed were shorter, cautious. No more jokes. No more veiled insults. They knew now. I had never needed to explain myself. They had made themselves loud enough. It was Richard's voice that had broken their echo chamber. And he hadn't done it for performance. He had done it because some debts live in the marrow. That day in DC, I had saved his life without needing his name. Today he gave mine back to a room that tried to erase it, and that mattered more than any spotlight ever could. The door to the lounge was already ajar when I pushed it open. It smelled of old wood and expensive perfume, the kind of room designed for quiet power plays after the main event. Low light, deep leather chairs, a crystal decanter of something no one would drink. I stepped inside without hesitation. I wasn't hiding, I wasn't resting. I just needed a moment away from the crowd, still trying to decide what to do with the truth they'd just witnessed. She arrived less than 2 minutes later. Martha Reese never did let silence last long when she couldn't control it. She didn't knock. She didn't greet me. She walked in like she owned the room, like it owed her something, and stopped 2 feet from where I sat. Arms crossed, jacket draped over my lap. Her voice was tight, measured. "We need to talk." I stayed seated. "Do we?" She bristled. "There are reporters outside. Someone leaked video of the salute. Of Richard's statement. It's already online. I just got a call from Cynthia. Then from the deans. There's chatter on Twitter and Reddit. They're calling it a patriotic moment. A reckoning. Even the Army PR division posted it." I didn't blink. She continued, her tone sharper. "This is putting us in a difficult position. Lydia's furious. Jacob's embarrassed. Richard's being hailed as some kind of hero for restoring dignity. You could at least issue a brief comment. Clarify that this wasn't a political stunt." I looked at her, really looked. Her heels were perfect, her lipstick retouched. But her eyes were frantic, darting, calculating. "No one said anything about politics," I said. "Except you." Martha exhaled hard through her nose. "Don't get smart. I'm trying to fix this." "Fix what exactly?" "That the woman you spent years pretending didn't exist finally got called by her name." She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if proximity would soften the blow. "You made this about you. You hijacked your sister's wedding. You let that man Richard make a speech drag up some dusty war story like this was the 4th of July. I stood. He didn't drag up anything, he told the truth. She hesitated, then folded her arms defensively. Still, you could have stopped it, you could have deflected. I tilted my head. And why would I do that? Because you've already gotten what you wanted, haven't you? What exactly do you think I wanted? She didn't answer. I walked to the sideboard, opened my clutch, and pulled out 2 folded sheets of paper. I handed them to her. Her hands twitched as she took them. She read the first one photocopy of the anonymous letter sent to the Army's Inspector General's office in 2018. She paused midway, her breath catching. Then the second page, a full linguistic analysis from an Army legal team. Word patterns, syntax, phrasing comparisons, a 92% match with Lydia's writing. Several markers pointing toward maternal influence. She didn't finish the page, her voice was dry. You kept this number, I had it archived. Linda Snow did. She figured I might need it someday. Why bring it now? Because you walked into this lounge expecting me to clean up your mess. I wanted to remind you who you were speaking to. Her fingers crumpled the paper slightly. You were always crueler than people realized. No, I said. I'm just no longer willing to be quiet for your comfort. She sat down slowly across from me, suddenly looking older. We didn't know it would go that far. Lydia was angry. You were getting everything. The recognition, the rank, the press. She felt invisible. And your solution was to make me invisible instead. We didn't think it would derail your promotion. Of course you didn't. Because none of you thought of me as a real person. Just a role to be managed. A problem to be minimized. Martha's hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced tightly. You're going to go public with this. I haven't said a word. I didn't leak anything. I didn't invite cameras. I didn't ask Richard to speak. She nodded slowly, staring past me now, like the walls had more to say than I did. Can't you just release a statement? Something gentle. You know how these things spiral. No, I said, but it's your family. No, I said again, slower this time. It's your family. I've been something else to you for a long time now. She looked up then, finally really looking at me. You think I hate you. I don't think it. I lived it. Tears welled, but she blinked them back before they could fall. I almost pitied her for that, her refusal to feel things all the way through. You always wanted to be the hero, she said softly. I looked her in the eye. I just didn't want to be the villain in your story anymore. We sat in silence. She tried to reach forward then, almost reflexively. But her hand stopped halfway. Hung there between us. I didn't move. She withdrew it. Wiped her palm against her skirt as though brushing off something too warm to handle. Her voice dropped. You really won't help, I already have. I showed up. I let the truth be seen. That wasn't what she wanted, but it was all I had to give. She stood, shoulders drawn tight, hands trembling again. You've ruined everything. I didn't raise my voice. I just stopped pretending you hadn't already done that. She didn't argue. She didn't say goodbye. She walked out with the same click of heels I'd grown up resenting. I waited another full minute before I exhaled. The silence she left behind didn't ache. It settled. Final. Cold. And earned. The highway out of Wilmont felt longer than it should have. I drove with the windows cracked just enough to let the cold air cut through the stiffness in my lungs. I didn't blast music. I didn't make phone calls. Just the hum of tires over pavement and the silence that followed me out of that town like a long shadow. By the time I crossed the state line into Maryland, my phone had already buzzed 12 times. I didn't check it. But I knew what it was. Someone had posted the video. Someone always does. I checked into a small hotel outside Bethesda, not fancy but clean. Quiet. The kind of place where no one asked questions and the front desk clerk didn't flinch at the military ID I used for the discount. That night I watched the clip. I had expected shaky footage, poor sound. But it was crystal clear. Richard Hartley rising from his seat in the ballroom. The room going still. His words strong and deliberate. This is Major General Madeline Reese. She once saved my life. "General, ma'am." Then the salute. The camera panned to the guests, their expressions frozen mid-reaction. Some stunned, some ashamed, some just silent. There was no background music. No edits, no commentary. Just truth, standing bare in its uniform. It was surreal watching myself from the outside. The next morning, the view count had crossed 1 million. By the end of the day, 3 headlines started appearing. Father of groom salutes guest at daughter's wedding. And the reason will floor you. The general no one expected. The sister who showed up. I ignored interview requests from morning shows, podcasts, talk panels, YouTubers, and one late-night host who offered to fly me out first class. They wanted a viral guest. I wasn't one. Instead, I sat down with a notebook. Legal pad, blue pen. Old habits. I wrote a mission outline. Then a list of names. Then a list of needs. By Thursday, I had a name for it. Valor Circle. Not a charity, not a headline-grabbing movement. Just a network. Quiet, private. A space where military personnel, especially women, could find support when their battles came from within their own homes. Because not all enemies wear different uniforms. Some share your last name. Some send anonymous letters. Some sit at your family's table and pretend not to know what they did. I rented a space in Arlington. Just one room. Old furniture, no flag on the wall. A coffee maker and 2 couches. The first woman I met there was a Navy lieutenant whose parents hadn't spoken to her since she came out. The second was a retired medic whose brother sued her for the family home while she was deployed. They didn't want cameras, they didn't want applause, they wanted someone to believe them. I didn't speak much, I listened. When they asked why I started it, I just said I understand. The story stopped being about a wedding. It became something else. A thank you echoed through strangers. A moment of dignity captured without consent but transformed into something gentler than justice. I never spoke to Lydia again. She and Jacob flew to Costa Rica for their honeymoon, returned to Boston, and settled into married life. I heard through a cousin's text that she started a lifestyle blog called The Refined Reese. Sponsored posts. Yoga outfits. Skincare tips. Not a single photo of me among her family albums online. That was fine. I didn't need her version of me to vanish. I just needed mine to stand. Martha didn't reach out again. But a package arrived at the Valor Circle office 2 weeks later. No return address. Inside, my father's bronze star wrapped in linen. And a single line typed on plain paper. He would have been proud. I didn't cry. I placed the medal on a shelf behind my desk next to a photo of my unit from Kandahar. No plaque. No caption. Just presence. Sometimes people need a symbol. Sometimes they just need a room. One afternoon, as I was closing up, the receptionist knocked once. "There's a man asking for you." I opened the door to find Richard Hartley standing in the hallway. No suit this time. Just a wool coat and a paper bag in his hand. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," he said. "It's not." He handed me the bag. Inside, a jar of honey from his estate and a handwritten letter. I just wanted to say thank you again. Not for what happened in DC that night, but for showing my family what grace looks like when it doesn't beg for applause. We sat for 20 minutes. Talked about nothing and everything. When he left, I stood at the window and watched him walk away. This time I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a name. One earned. And one finally spoken aloud. The lake in autumn looked like a breath held between seasons. I had settled into a cabin tucked beneath maples near the edge of Millbrook, Vermont. Not hidden, just quieter. The kind of place where people wave without asking too many questions. Where the loudest sound after sunset is the creak of wood and the soft shuffle of leaves. Most mornings began with the same sound, the thud of a basket landing on my porch. A boy named Evan from the local bakery delivered it before school. He'd knock once, wait until I opened the door, then nod, like we were trading secrets. One morning he lingered longer than usual, hands stuffed in the pockets of his puffer vest. "My dad said you were a general." I glanced at him, smiled. "Used to be." He nodded slowly as if trying to decide what that meant. Then said, "You don't look like the ones in movies." "That's a compliment," I said. They always get the hair wrong anyway. He grinned and took off down the hill, his sneakers kicking up frost. I stepped inside and unwrapped the warm bread, the smell of cinnamon rising like memory. On the small table by the front window, the mail sat where I'd dropped it the night before. Mostly flyers and bills. But one envelope was different. Pale gray. No return address. My name was written in familiar cursive. I sat down to open it. Madeline, I've thought about calling, but I figured you wouldn't pick up. That's fair. I don't know how to explain what I did. Maybe there's no good way. I think I thought I was protecting your sister. Maybe I just wanted to protect myself from being seen as the kind of mother who didn't know how to raise two daughters right. You were always strong. And I guess I thought strong people don't need softness. I see now I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to see clearer now. I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner. Love, Martha. I folded the letter and looked out the window. The lake was still. Ducks cut slow trails across its glassy surface. Somewhere behind the trees, a chainsaw buzzed. Life went on. I didn't cry, I didn't write back, because I knew she had seen me clearly all along. She just didn't like what she saw. And now, after everything, she didn't get to be part of the life I had finally built without her fingerprints on it. There was peace in that. Peace not because I had shouted the truth loud enough for them to hear, but because I had finally stopped whispering it to myself. Not every wound needs to bleed for others to see it's there. Some simply stop reopening. I spent the rest of the morning tending to the small garden behind the cabin. Tomatoes were long gone. The last of the kale was frost-bitten but defiant. I pulled weeds slowly, letting my hands stay in the dirt longer than they needed to. There were no visitors. No reporters, no salutes. Just quiet. Sometimes I taught free self-defense classes at the community center in town. Not often. Just enough to keep my edges from softening too much. I liked showing the girls how to keep their feet grounded. How to use their breath like armor. At night I read. Sometimes poetry. Sometimes manuals. Old habits again. And every so often I'd receive another letter. Not from Martha. From women I'd never met. Soldiers, nurses, engineers, daughters. They'd heard of Valor Circle. Some wrote pages, some only sent 2 lines. You reminded me who I was. Or I thought I was the only one. Or simply thank you for standing up when no one else did. I kept every letter in a wooden box beside my bed. I never counted them. One day I might. But not yet. Because there was still more living to do. More silence to fill with better things. More names to remember that weren't mine. So, if you've ever been erased by silence, if you've ever been pushed to the edge of your own story, if you've ever been the one they didn't clap for, didn't speak for, didn't stand up for, you're not invisible and you're not alone. Leave a word. Below. Just one. And I promise I'll read it.